On February 22, 1943, the Nazi regime had already ruled for a decade, suffocating any spark of freedom in Germany. On that cold morning in Munich, a courtroom filled with inquisitive stares becomes the stage of a dark theater. At the center of the scene, young students from the White Rose Group face charges of treason for distributing pamphlets denouncing the horrors of the war waged by Hitler. There is no room for defense. The trial is a choreographed farce, a spectacle of intimidation. The judge, enraged, does not allow interruptions. His voice dominates the room, crushing any attempt at dialogue. Every word spoken, every authoritarian gesture serves a single purpose: to silence any act of resistance. Even so, the members of the White Rose remain serene. Even in the face of hostility, they refuse to deny what they believe. Amid screams and threats, they uphold the dignity of those who chose not to remain silent in the face of terror. In a courtroom where justice was murdered every day, one man stood out not for his impartiality, but for his fanaticism, cruelty, and blind loyalty to the most brutal regime of the 20th century. Roland Freisler, the Nazi judge who screamed his death sentences, a brilliant jurist who used his talent to serve terror. From prisoner in Russia to central figure in the cruelest trials of Nazi Germany, Freisler personified what happens when law is shaped to serve hatred. Karl Roland Freisler was born on October 30, 1893, in the city of Celle, then part of the German Empire. His father, Julius Freisler, was an engineer and civil servant, and his mother, Charlotte, came from modest origins. The young Roland showed academic promise, standing out in school and displaying a particular talent for language and debate, traits that would mark his future career, even if for sinister purposes. World War I Freisler was studying law at the University of Kiel when World War I broke out in 1914, interrupting his studies. He served actively in the Imperial German Army during the war after enlisting as a Fahnenjunker, officer cadet, in 1914. While serving on the front lines with the 22nd Division, he was awarded the Iron Cross Second Class for heroism in combat. In October 1915, he was wounded in action on the Eastern Front and taken as a prisoner of war by the Imperial Russian forces. While imprisoned, Freisler learned to speak Russian and developed an interest in Marxism after the onset of the Russian Revolution. The Bolshevik Provisional Authority, which took over the prisoner of war camp where Freisler was held, used him as a commissar of the camp, organizing food supply logistics from 1917 to 1918. In the late 1930s, during Joseph Stalin's Great Purge in the Soviet Union, Freisler attended the Moscow trials to observe the proceedings against the condemned. Freisler later rejected any insinuation that he had collaborated with the Soviets, the ideological enemies of Nazi Germany, but his subsequent career as a political officer in Germany was overshadowed by rumors about his time as a commissar with the Reds. After his release and return to Germany in 1918, Freisler resumed his legal studies. His fluency in Russian set him apart from many of his peers, and he completed his doctoral thesis in law at the University of Jena in 1922. During this period, German society was in turmoil. War reparations, hyperinflation, and the humiliating terms of the Treaty of Versailles fueled political instability. Various extremist movements were taking shape, including the Nazi Party, led by the incendiary agitator Adolf Hitler. Initially, Freisler had no direct connection to the party, but worked as a lawyer and defender in several politically charged cases, earning a reputation for his fierce courtroom demeanor. By the late 1920s, Freisler's political orientation took a radical turn to the right. On July 9, 1925, he joined the Nazi Party, becoming member number 9679. He also secured a position as a city councilor in Kassel, where his oratory skills and legal knowledge caught the attention of Nazi Party officials. Freisler quickly became known for his fervent devotion to the party's message, advocating for radical reforms that placed the collective will of the German people above any notion of individual rights. In his speeches, he railed against the enemies of the state, a category that, in his mind, included Jews, socialists, and anyone who criticized Hitler and the Nazi Party. On March 24, 1928, Freisler married Marion Rusiger, and from this marriage 2 sons were born. When Hitler took power in January 1933, Freisler's career prospects soared. The new regime required legal minds capable of rationalizing the dismantling of democratic institutions by the Nazis, and Freisler proved more than willing. In February 1933, after the Nazi seizure of power, Freisler was appointed ministerial director in the Prussian Ministry of Justice under Hans Kerrl. He was put in charge of the personnel department and used his authority to expel Jewish members from the staff. Freisler's command of legal texts, his mental agility, his dramatic and forceful courtroom rhetoric, combined with his fervent conversion to Nazi ideology, made him the most feared judge in Nazi Germany and the embodiment of Nazism within the internal legal system. However, despite his talents and loyalty, Adolf Hitler never appointed him to any position outside the legal system. This may have occurred because Freisler was an isolated figure, with no backing within the upper echelons of the Nazi hierarchy. Furthermore, he had been politically compromised by his brother, Oswald Freisler, also a lawyer. Oswald had repeatedly served as a defense attorney against the regime's authority during increasingly politically motivated trials through which the Nazis sought to impose their tyrannical control over German society, and he had a habit of wearing his Nazi party badge during these hearings. Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels reprimanded Oswald Freisler and reported his actions to Adolf Hitler, who in response ordered his expulsion from the party. In 1941, during a discussion at the Führer headquarters about who to appoint to replace Franz Gürtner, the Reich Minister of Justice who had died, Goebbels suggested Roland Freisler as an option. Hitler's response, referring to Freisler's alleged red past, was, "That old Bolshevik?" No. Essentially, Freisler was among those who oversaw the legislative transformation that eroded civil liberties. This included the enactment of laws that allowed indefinite detention without trial and special judicial practices aimed at political offenses, crimes that, essentially, encompassed all forms of dissent. Behind the scenes, Freisler advocated for measures that destroyed the principle of equality before the law, replacing it with a racialized hierarchy. Roland Freisler was a loyal Nazi ideologue and used his legal knowledge to adapt his fascist ideals to legislative and judicial practice. He published a document titled "The Biological Racial Task Involved in the Reform of Juvenile Criminal Law," in which he argued that racially alien minors, racially degenerate, racially incurable, or severely defective should be sent to youth centers or correctional institutions. Furthermore, these individuals should be segregated from youths who were German and racially valuable. Freisler also strongly advocated for the creation of laws to punish the so-called racial defilement, a Nazi term used to define sexual relations between Aryans and those considered of inferior races. In 1933, he even published a pamphlet demanding the legal prohibition of sexual relations between mixed-race individuals. Freisler's ideological opinions reflected what was to come, for 2 years later, on September 15, 1935, the Nazi regime announced 2 new laws: the Reich Citizenship Law, which defined a citizen as a person of German or related blood, which meant that Jews, defined as a separate race, could not be full citizens of Germany and had no political rights, and the Law for the Protection of German Blood and German Honor, which prohibited future mixed marriages and sexual relations between Jews and persons of German blood or German descent. The Nazis believed that such relations were dangerous because they gave rise to mixed-race children. According to their ideology, these children and their future offspring would end the purity of the German race. World War II began on September 1st, 1939, when Germany invaded Poland. The following month, Freisler introduced the concept of the early juvenile criminal. This decree provided the legal basis for imposing the death penalty and prison sentences on minors for the first time in German legal history. At least 72 young Germans were sentenced to death by Nazi courts. In August 1942, Freisler reached his most feared position yet, President of the People's Court, established by Hitler in 1934 to handle cases of treason and political dissent. Ostensibly part of the judicial apparatus, the court functioned as a political weapon. It ignored the established judicial system, ensuring that verdicts aligned with the regime's demands for harsh punishments against opponents. By the time Freisler took office, the People's Court had already sentenced thousands to prison or death. However, under his leadership, the execution rate exploded. He prided himself on delivering guilty verdicts in nearly 90% of cases, and between 1942 and 1945, more than 5,000 death sentences were handed down by him. One of Freisler's first major trials as president of the People's Court involved the White Rose, an underground group of university students in Munich who opposed Hitler's regime through non-violent protest. Arrested in February 1943, the central members of the White Rose faced trial before Freisler. In a public hearing, he called them traitors to the fatherland, hurling a barrage of insults and rhetorical questions meant to humiliate and terrorize the defendants. The Scholl siblings, Christoph Probst, and others demonstrated remarkable composure in the face of Freisler's furious outbursts. Despite their calm behavior, the verdict was never in question. All were sentenced to death. Freisler's courtroom style was both theatrical and terrifying. He believed in using humiliation as a tool of domination, shouting and interrupting the defendants, belittling their motives, and framing dissent as betrayal of Germany's war effort. Observers noted that he often wore a blood-red judicial robe, slamming his fists on the bench while calling the defendants traitors, worms, or parasites. Trials were often rushed, sometimes lasting only a few hours, and defendants were given minimal opportunity to prepare and present their defense. Freisler's approach to justice was immersed in the Nazi conviction that the only appropriate outcome was total acceptance of Hitler's will, or death. Criticism from the few traditional judges still remaining in the judicial system was quickly silenced or ignored. In all proceedings of the People's Court, Freisler displayed clear bias in favor of the Nazi state and its ideology. His manner of handling cases went beyond regulation and the judge's code of conduct. As a result, he used the law in a sadistic and perverse way. As a National Socialist fanatic, he said he wanted to judge as the Führer himself would judge the case. Freisler's yelling during trials made it difficult for sound technicians to record the defendants' responses. Sometimes he shouted so much that the microphone sensitivity and volume had to be adjusted to a much lower level. For Freisler, the People's Court was explicitly a political court. In trials, he shamed the accused, barely listened to them, and constantly interrupted and shouted at them. Furthermore, he conducted the proceedings in a completely irrational manner. This deliberate and selective humiliation of defendants occurred both verbally and non-verbally, as, for example, the Nazis gave the accused old, oversized clothes without a belt. In this way, when they stood before the court, they were forced to constantly hold up their pants. On January 20th, 1942, 15 high-ranking officials of the Nazi Party and the German government gathered at a mansion in the Berlin suburb of Wannsee to discuss, coordinate, and implement the so-called final solution to the Jewish question. The final solution was the codename the Nazis used to refer to the systematic and deliberate extermination of European Jews. Adolf Hitler had authorized this genocidal plan throughout Europe in 1941. although the exact date remains unknown to this day. By the time the Wannsee Conference took place, most of the participants were already aware that the Nazi regime had committed mass murders of Jews and other civilians in the Soviet Union and Serbia, areas occupied by Germany. None of the officials present at the meeting, including Roland Freisler, who would provide legal counsel for the plan, objected to the final solution policy announced by Heydrich. Heydrich indicated that approximately 11 million Jews in Europe would be exterminated through the measures of the final solution. This number included not only Jews residing in Axis-controlled Europe, but also the Jewish populations of the United Kingdom and neutral nations such as Switzerland, Ireland, Sweden, Spain, Portugal, and the European part of Turkey. On February 18, 1943, Hans and Sophie Scholl were distributing leaflets at Ludwig Maximilian University when they were reported to the secret police, the Gestapo, and subsequently arrested. During the interrogation, it was discovered that the two siblings were part of a resistance group called the White Rose, which wrote pamphlets critical of Hitler and the German people. They encouraged citizens to rebel against the Nazi regime, denounced the murder of hundreds of thousands of Poles, and demanded an end to the war. During questioning, Sophie was offered a reduced sentence if she admitted that her brother had led her astray, but she refused. "I will not betray my brother or my principles. I will make no deal with the Nazis." On February 22, 1943, Freisler flew to Munich for the sole purpose of presiding over their trial. Upon entering the courtroom, Sophie Scholl surprised everyone by saying to Freisler, "After all, someone had to start. What we wrote and expressed is also believed by many others. They just don't have the courage to say it as we did." She also interrupted Freisler with a statement. "You know the war is lost. Why don't you have the courage to face it?" After half a day of trial, the verdict was as expected: guilty. Freisler had sentenced them to death by hanging, but fearing they would become martyrs if publicly executed, it was decided they would be killed by guillotine. On April 19, 1943, Freisler was once again transferred to serve as the judge in the second trial of the White Rose members. At the beginning of this second trial, Freisler began energetically shouting at the accused, warning them, "National Socialism does not need a penal code for traitors like you. I will make this process short." After this warning, an assistant handed him the penal code, and without saying a word, Freisler threw it at the defendant's bench, forcing one of them to duck to avoid being hit in the head. Of the 13 defendants, 3 were sentenced to death, 9 to prison terms, and 1 was unexpectedly acquitted. Another victim of Freisler was Elfriede Schultz, sister of the German-born novelist Erich Maria Remarque. On May 10, 1933, on the initiative of Nazi propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels, Remarque's books were publicly declared unpatriotic and thus banned. As a result, copies were removed from all libraries, and their sale or publication was restricted throughout the country. While Erich left Germany, his sister Elfriede did the opposite. She stayed in Germany with her husband and 2 children. However, she ended up being arrested after her landlord overheard her saying that the war driven by the Nazis was lost. For that comment, she was turned over to the Nazi Party. The charge against her was based on allegedly trying to undermine Germany's war effort. During the trial, Freisler told Elfriede, "Your brother is beyond our reach, but you will not escape us." Elfriede Schultz was decapitated by guillotine on December 16, 1943. As the war progressed, the atmosphere in Germany grew increasingly desperate, and popular support for the regime gradually eroded. A growing group of intellectuals, military officers, and ordinary citizens began contemplating the viability of overthrowing Hitler. When, on July 20, 1944, members of the German armed forces attempted and failed to assassinate Hitler at the Wolf's Lair, his headquarters in Rastenburg, East Prussia, the conspirators found themselves at the mercy of the People's Court. In the days and weeks that followed, Hitler's security apparatus captured a large number of suspects. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel was pressured to commit suicide, while others, including Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg, General Friedrich Ulbricht, and Colonel General Ludwig Beck, were either immediately executed or forced to take their own lives. Many others accused of participating in the conspiracy were brought to trial before Freisler at the People's Court. In these trials, Freisler's reputation for cruelty reached its peak. He alternated between mocking the aristocratic origins of some conspirators and condemning them as cowards who had stabbed frontline soldiers in the back. The courtroom was equipped with cameras to record these frenzied proceedings, a form of propaganda meant to showcase the merciless justice of the Nazi state. The motives behind this coup attempt were quite varied and not necessarily tied to the crimes committed during the Holocaust, since several of the conspirators personally intervened to ensure the final solution was carried out. However, most of them had a more pragmatic reason to assassinate their leader: to save Germany from a catastrophic defeat brought about by Hitler's increasingly irrational leadership. In the following days, Hitler ordered a massive manhunt for the conspirators, which lasted for months. In August 1944, some of the detained authors of the failed coup were brought before Freisler to be punished. Hitler had ordered that those found guilty were to be hanged like cattle. The proceedings were filmed to be shown to the German people in newsreels. These recordings showed how Freisler conducted his court. Frequently, the judge would begin the trial in a rational manner, interrogating the accused in an analytical way. Despite this beginning, his attitude would suddenly change, and Freisler would violently reprimand the defendants, even yelling at them from the bench. This shift, from a cold and clinical interrogation to an outburst of rage and fury, was designed to psychologically disarm, torment, and humiliate the accused, while also destroying any attempt at a defense. At one point, Freisler shouted at Field Marshal Erwin von Witzleben, who was trying to hold up his pants after being given clothes that were too large. "You dirty old man! Why do you keep playing with your trousers?" Nevertheless, the accused never lost their dignity. It is said that Erwin von Witzleben's final words to Freisler were, "You may hand us over to the executioner. In 3 months, the outraged and tormented people will call you to account and drag you alive through the mud of the streets." Caesar von Hoffacker, a prominent figure in the resistance in France, interrupted Freisler, saying, "Be quiet now, Herr Freisler, because today it's my head, but within a year it will be yours." When Freisler sarcastically referred to General Erich Feldgiebel's impending death, Feldgiebel replied, "Then hurry up, Mr. President, or you'll be hanging before we are." When Ulrich Wilhelm, Count of Schwerin von Schwanenfeld, devastated by the conditions of his imprisonment, was brought into court without a belt or tie, he too tried to preserve his dignity. He declared that his opposition to Hitler was due to the countless murders in Germany and abroad. However, he was constantly interrupted by an enraged Freisler, who finally shouted furiously, "You are truly garbage." In the end, over 7,000 people were detained. Of those, 4,980, including von Witzleben, von Hoffacker, Count Schwerin von Schwanenfeld, and General Feldgiebel, were executed, often without the slightest evidence. Some of the executions took place just 2 hours after the verdict. Although the People's Court had always been a form of legal theater, the trials related to the July 20th plot fully exposed this grotesque spectacle to the German public. Freisler's contempt for the defendants was matched only by his devotion to Hitler. He not only handed out death sentences generously, but also devised humiliating procedures, such as removing the belts and suspenders of the accused so they would have to hold up their trousers. Despite his unwavering passion in persecuting opponents of Nazi Germany, Freisler's activities were abruptly cut short. On February 3, 1945, 3 months before the collapse of the Third Reich, Allied bombers targeted Berlin in a devastating air raid. The building of the People's Court was hit while the then 51-year-old judge was presiding over a trial. A falling masonry column crushed him, killing him instantly. Some witnesses claimed he was found clutching the file of one of the defendants. In a macabre irony, the man who had orchestrated so many death sentences did not live to see the unconditional surrender of Germany, which took place in May 1945. After the Nazi defeat, the Allied courts dismantled the criminal justice apparatus of the Third Reich. Judges like Freisler were either dead or imprisoned. But this did not erase the impact of their actions. Only a fraction of the legal officials who participated in the Nazi system were held accountable. Many of them returned to legal practice after the war. At the very least, the People's Court was formally abolished, and its decisions were declared null and void by post-war German authorities. Luisa von Benda, wife of General Alfred Jodl, recounted more than 25 years later that she was working at the Lutzow hospital when Freisler's corpse was brought in. Upon seeing the body of the terrible magistrate, a hospital worker commented, "It is God's verdict." No one responded. Freisler's body was buried in his wife's family grave in Berlin. His name does not appear on the tombstone. Thank you very much for your audience. May God bless you all. A big hug, and see you soon.